the thing that you suggested we might talk about that I thought would be a good place to start, that is one of your more recent interests, is neuroprediction of crime. Of course, this sounds like Minority Report. Can you tell us something about the state of play in neuroprediction of crime?
Sure. The first thing to say is it's not like Minority Report. It'd be great, I suppose, if it were, but maybe not.
The whole
In this case,
thing.
it's not like it. In Minority Report, what you do is predict when the person is going to commit which particular crime the moment before they do it, so you can stop the crime in advance. This prediction is much more like weather prediction. There's a 70% chance it's going to rain at some time tomorrow. I can't tell you when the first drop's going to fall or exactly where it's going to rain, but I can tell you the probabilities. Still, despite its inaccuracy, that kind of prediction can be very useful to the law. The law, when it sentences some people to longer sentences than others, bases that decision partly on who they think is dangerous. When they decide who to give probation instead of jail, when they decide who to give parole out of jail early for good behavior, all of those decisions are based on predictions of who's dangerous and who's not. In addition, the Supreme Court in Hendricks, Kansas versus Hendricks, 1996, decided that it is constitutional for the state of Kansas to keep pedophiles in prison after their sentences have been served on the grounds that they are dangerous to other people. It's more complicated than that, but at least part of the decision of who you can keep in jail after the sentence is over is based on a prediction of future crime. So the legal system uses prediction at many, many points in the legal process. And then the question is, how do you make those predictions accurate? What they do now is either the judge, or the parole board looks the person in the eye and says, "You look dangerous to me," which is kind of crazy. They're not trained to do that. So sometimes they bring in psychiatrists, but the APA, the American Psychiatric Association itself, says that they are not expert at making those judgments. They're there to treat people, not to predict. And so how are you going to do it? Well, you can do it statistically with large bodies of data over large numbers of criminals, but that seems kind of impersonal.
Absolutely. I mean, because it's the most personal thing in the world, who you incarcerate, and to say that we're incarcerating you because a bunch of other people did this seems outrageous.
Right. Even if it's more accurate, many people have objections to that. And that's where neuroprediction comes in, because now it is individual. If we're looking at your brain and we're saying the state of your brain is something that we have good reason to believe is connected to crime, then we're going to be able to predict that you will commit a crime. So, for example, we now have an algorithm that can diagnose psychopathy within plus or minus 2 on the psychopath scale. And people who are over 30 on that scale have about an 80% chance of recidivating violently, that is, committing another violent crime within 6 years. And normal people who are below, say, 20 on that scale will have a 20% chance. And so there's a big difference between this one group of people and the other, and you can use brain scans to help you place them on this continuum from the very dangerous to the not very dangerous.
Now, of course, once someone is in the legal system and has committed a crime, then we're familiar with the idea of deciding how dangerous they are and setting their sentence accordingly, because, of course, that's what you do if somebody's committed a crime previously, then we say we can give you a longer sentence. So that's just a very crude version of this, but obviously, the next step is to imprison someone before they've done something at all, if they have the wrong kinds of brains.
And I don't know any person who works on this stuff seriously who thinks that neuroprediction will ever be used for that. The reason is that the prevalence is too low. If you go to the doctor and get a scan for colon cancer and it comes back positive, well, what's the odds that you really have colon cancer? It's less than 1 in 10 on some calculations, because there's a certain false positive rate. It's going to say that you have cancer when you don't. And the number of people who have cancer is so low that the number of false positives is greater than the number of true positives. Well, the same thing happens when you're talking about violent crime, which is less than 1% of the population. Very low rate in the general population. So if you use these tests in the general population, you're going to make more mistakes than you make correct predictions. But if, as you said, if you use it on people who have already been convicted of crimes, that's like using a medical test on somebody who already has the symptoms of an illness. Now it's going to be much, much more reliable.
Well, but imagine I have two people and they have the same types of brains, or they get the same kind of results in the scans. I don't know the neurophysics, but and one of them has committed a crime and the other one hasn't. Are you going to say, basically you're saying you have the same types of brains, but we're going to say you're much more likely to commit a crime in the future because you have in the past? Aren't you assuming that the reason they committed a crime is because of their brain?
We're not going to say you're going to commit it in the future because you committed it in the past. What we're saying is we have better evidence that you will commit it in the future in the case where you did commit a crime, because we know in addition to your brain being in that situation, we know that you committed a crime. We have more evidence in the one case than in the other. And you have to go on how much evidence you've got.
But it's not evidence that they committed a crime because their brain was a certain way. I mean, you're just saying you committed a crime and your brain is this way. And the reason why we think you're going to do it again is because your brain is this way. But you haven't established the link between their brain being this way and them committing the crime in the past.
Absolutely. You don't know whether they committed it in the past because of some kind of brain condition or not. You can't know that because you didn't do the brain scan in the past. Right. But still, the evidence we have is this person committed a crime and they have, a smaller than average paralimbic system if you're using the structural scan to predict PCLR. Yes, you've got this brain condition and you committed a crime in the past. That gives us reason to believe that you will. We don't know for sure. We have to admit that we're going to be wrong sometimes because you can't always be right, but we're going to be a lot better than some legal official looking the person in the eyes and saying, you look nasty to me. Because that kind of judgment is what's going on in the courts now.
So you think this is to be welcomed because it will replace decisions that are already being made on ridiculous grounds but are anyway being made? You're saying this is an advance because if the decisions are to be made, at least they're going to be on some kind of scientific basis because, of course, no doubt you come across plenty of people who are horrified by this idea.
Oh, absolutely, because people are scared that they're going to get thrown in jail, because they happen to have this brain condition and and they're not really dangerous at all. And there will be mistakes, and you have to double check everything and be absolutely certain. But sure, the promise is there. Right now, you have psychopaths in prisons who commit 4 to 5 times as many violent crimes as the other people in prison, and yet they get out on parole earlier and more often than the non-psychopaths because they're manipulative. They lie, they manipulate people, they cheat their way out of prison, and they're good at it, and it works. Now, how are we going to stop that? If we have something like a brain scan, we've got an objective tool, to determine their status, then cannot be fooled by the tricks that they have learned.
So, yeah, let's talk about psychopaths because that was another one of your topics. How old is this notion of psychopath, and do you think that it has evolved considerably? I mean, what's the etymology of psychopath? It's something that we're familiar with from popular culture now, but has it become a completely different thing now because of the advance of neuroscience and these tests for them, or do you think that we're now getting better at identifying what we previously called psychopaths in the past?
So that's always a tricky question, whether we're talking about the same thing. Do I mean the same thing by water that Aristotle meant by water when he thought the earth was composed of earth, air, fire, and water? Well, I don't know. I mean something kind of like that, but I sure know a lot more about it. And I think the same thing holds for psychopathy. People knew that there were strange people who didn't appear to have any conscience and would commit crime after crime after crime. That's, been well recorded in many cultures for hundreds of years, but they didn't have a good way of diagnosing it. They didn't have a very precise understanding. They couldn't, for example, distinguish a gang member who had become immune to violence because of their experiences from a psychopath who was born without empathy. And that's why they're able to do the things they do. Our modern notion distinguishes those two. The old notion didn't. So I don't know whether we're talking about the same thing or not, but we do know a lot more about them today.
Did you come into this as kind of a skeptic and you were convinced by the science, or how did you come around? Because I imagine that you encounter a lot of philosophers who are very critical of this, very, very cautious of saying that there is such a thing as a psychopath. I mean, what won you over?
Yeah, so there's skeptics and there are cautious people. I think I came into it very cautious. But, a skeptic sometimes won't listen to the arguments on the other side. But I thought, most crime was produced by social circumstances, and, I was totally in that camp. And then I started reading the literature and realized there really are brain differences between the people who show one pattern of behavior and the people who show another pattern of behavior. And the evidence is just overwhelming that there really is a group of people out there with a brain disorder that makes them more likely to commit violent crimes.
And is this something that's genetic, or is it is it the result of lesions, or is it just something that is it inheritable, or what kind of factors affect it?
So S.E. Vitting at University College London studied over 3,000 pairs of twins. The way they do those, fraternal twins, identical twins.
I'm glad I'm not a twin.
They form brains together and so on. And found that the psychopathy score was about 70% heritable, which is more than most estimates of schizophrenia. So yes, there seems to be a genetic component. How does it work? Well, nobody's really sure because there hasn't been enough research on this. It's very difficult to do the research because you have to go into the prisons. That's where most of them are, and many prisons won't let you in, and for good reason, for understandable reason, there isn't enough research. But the basic idea that most people work with today is that a genetic condition produces malformations in the paralimbic system. Some people think more specifically in an area called the amygdala, and that because of those brain deficits, psychopaths are not able to learn the normal moral or social rules. They're not scared of punishment, so they don't feel empathy. They don't respect authority. Well, how are you going to teach them moral rules? That's the problem.
So when you say they're not able to learn, do you mean that, because there's two ways to understand that. There's this sort of cognitive sense, I just can't retain the information. And then there's the sense of, yes, I see that is a rule that is writing on a piece of paper. It just, what's it to me?
It's more like, what's it to me? So consider this experiment. If you take a psychopath, you take a normal person, and you say, when I get to 0, you're going to get a shock in your hand that's going to hurt. It's strong enough to hurt. 5, 4.
You're making me nervous.
2, 1, 0. Just hearing it makes most people nervous. But it's really going to happen to you. You're usually sweating by the time the person says 4. Psychopaths don't show that. They don't anticipate the punishment, or if they do anticipate it, they're not worried about it, or they figure they can't do anything about it anyway. So why should they start sweating? And so as a result, they can't be threatened. You can't say, okay, if you do that, I'm going to punish you, because that doesn't bother them. They never learn not to do it from the threat of punishment because they don't have that brain circuit that is needed for that kind of learning.
I was listening to Dexter Filkins, the ex-New York Times reporter, the Iraq reporter, who's now does stuff for the New Yorker. He was talking on the radio yesterday, and he was saying that he is convinced that ISIS, the people in charge of ISIS, are basically psychopaths, and that the trouble with ISIS and the reason why they split away from Al Qaeda is because they're just too brutal. And that's why Al Qaeda didn't want these guys. They said, look, you're not going to work because you're going to turn the local population against you. And that happened, but they've researched. And so Filkins thinks that these people are not going to be able to hold on to power because all they care about is killing. Well, that suggests that psychopaths are actually very useful and very successful. And of course, there's all these studies that say that CEOs are psychopaths and so on. What's your view on that? I mean, it seems to be that we're thinking of psychopaths as just criminals, but these qualities will make you enormously successful under pressure. You know, Michael Jordan is a bit psychopathic when it comes to basketball. What should we think of this feature of the brain if we discover it in someone?
So I think all of that is just a bunch of bunk. I think that's just a misunderstanding.
So you think psychopath is a very narrow thing?
Well, there are many different reasons why people commit crimes. If you want to call them all psychopaths, then that's going to lump together things that are so different that it's going to not be of any help when it comes to trying to treat them and do something about it. The more focused diagnosis is going to be the more useful one. You take these people in ISIS, sure, they're into violence, but they're ideologues. They have an ideology they're working for. Psychopaths don't have any ideology they're working for. These people are devoted to their group, and they'll work for the other people in their group. Psychopaths don't work for other people or for the groups they're members of. It's a very different kind of thing. Gang members are very different from psychopaths. Gangs typically don't like psychopaths because a psychopath won't obey their leader. Psychopath thinks they are the one that ought to be leader, and every one of them thinks that, so they can't work together.
But can they be leaders? Can they acquire people to follow them, or do they obviously not care enough about other people to retain followers?
They certainly can. They're very manipulative. They can get people to follow them, but they're not going to get other psychopaths to follow them, so they're not going to form gangs of psychopaths.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. It's very useful in trying to control them. Take CEOs, for example. Most psychopaths move from town to town and job to job and relationship to relationship on a whim without a moment's notice or even sometimes a reason. They just feel like moving on. Well, people who do that aren't going to become CEOs. You have to work your way up through the company. You have to gain other people's respect to be a CEO. Now, I don't want to deny that some CEOs have psychopathic traits, right? They have some of the items that are distinctive of psychopathy. That for sure. But none of them have over 30 on the official scale, which is the official diagnosis. And my evidence for that is there's a book called Snakes in Suits by Robert Hare and Babiak is the co-author. And they are the two of the top experts in this area, and they went around looking for examples of true psychopaths in leadership positions in businesses and could not find any. And they're writing a book. If they could have found some, they would have put them in the book. But in the preface, they say none of the people we're talking about are true psychopaths, although they do have psychopathic traits.
Is it, now you say it's a scale. Does that imply that there's a scale in nature, or is depending on the size of the amygdala or the amount of damage to the amygdala or the relevant regions of the brain? I mean, is there a sliding scale of psychopaths, or is it, no, there's psychopaths, they're distinctively different, and there can be people who approach them in various attributes, but the psychopaths is a do we carve nature at the joints?
Yeah, is it a dimension or a kind? And the answer is, we don't know. We just don't know. It's hard to tell. If it's a genetic condition, there's some reason to think it's a kind. There's a certain genetic what would you call it? A genetic problem. Let's just use a general term. But it's a specific if there's a specific genes coding for it, it might be something that's very distinctive. And there might be other people who get close to psychopaths and have lots of their traits because of bad upbringing, and then end up looking like psychopaths, but they're not psychopaths for the same reason. The cause is very different. I'll give you an example of that. A study just came out of 8. Previously, we'd only known 2. So now we're up to 10 different people who have received very early on in their lives big frontal lobe damage. And so in the first case, it was like 15 and 18 months. Now they're up to 10 to 15 years. But in any case, many of these people with early brain damage in certain areas, in one case, for example, getting run over by a car when he was 15 months, they end up looking like psychopaths. But not exactly like psychopaths. They're very similar in many of their actions. But if you, for example, give them a Kohlberg moral judgment scale, the people with brain damage will get 1 and the psychopaths will score above average on moral judgment scales. Because they're good at manipulating. They know what needs to be said.
Now, it seems to me you're interested in, you go into areas that a lot of people get into philosophy to avoid, which is, actual science, right?
What am I thinking?
Have you actually met and interviewed somebody who qualifies as a psychopath, or is this?
Yeah, sure. I work with the Mind Research Network, headed by Kent Keel and Vince Calhoun down in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I've been lucky enough to be able to go out when they're doing interviews to diagnose psychopaths, and have seen various cases, close, not psychopath, but still in the prison, and psychopaths in the prison, and watch the interviews to see how they're conducted to get a better sense of what these people are really like.
Now, going back to the case of the book where they went around and they interviewed CEOs and they failed to find a CEO who was a psychopath. But given what you just said about how psychopaths are very good at knowing what you want to hear, how do they know they didn't just, the CEOs aren't super psychopaths who are extra good at disguising them? Did they actually do brain scans on these people, or?
No, in many cases, they did not do brain scans on the CEOs. It's very rare that a CEO would say, right, sure, I'll let you do a psychopath test on me, right, and a brain scan and all that. It'd be bad press if it got out the wrong way. No, so what they did is they looked at their behavior. For example, Bernie Madoff is often, they say, he's a psychopath. He doesn't care about the people that he, stole money from. But Bernie Madoff also spent a lot of his time doing charity work. And he could have ratted out his buddies when he was caught and convicted. And that would have made his circumstance in jail a lot better, minimum instead of medium security prison. He didn't rat out his buddies. He was faithful to his buddies. True psychopath would have just ratted out his buddies. It wouldn't have wasted time doing that charity work. Wouldn't have been so devoted to his family, and so on and so on. So what happens is people resemble psychopaths in one or two respects, and then they get labeled as psychopaths, when really psychopathy it's more like the perfect storm. Remember the movie The Perfect Storm, and the 3 storms all come together, and then there's this giant storm? Well, that's what happens with psychopaths. And you can get the single storms, the single bad traits of character in some people. But it's only when you get this overall collection of bad traits. They're narcissistic, they're parasitic, they're manipulative, they're violent, they're lacking in empathy, they're unstable, constantly seeking a stimulation and prone to boredom, and so on and so on. You add all those traits together, that's when you get above 30 on the scale, and that's when you get a true psychopath.
Now, there's obviously an enormous amount of interesting philosophical issues, like, is the life of a psychopath somehow worth less than the life of a so-called normal person? How do we measure the satisfaction that they get out of that? They don't sound like they could be very satisfied people, for one thing.
So I think it raises interesting questions of that very sort. For example, when I think of my life and what makes my life valuable, and I think almost everybody I know, the thing that contributes most to my life is my friends, the people I like, and helping my friends, through their problems or having fun with my friends. And they don't get that. They don't have friends. And that's just sad. But
Right.
they don't miss it. They get their kicks in other ways. And so if you have a purely hedonic theory of the good life, then it might be a little harder to say why they don't have the good life. Except, of course, there's a high risk of them being in prison and so on, but that doesn't seem to bother them. But if you have a more objective list theory of the good life, they don't have friends. That's a big bummer.
But, I mean, are they suicidal at all?
No, they're never suicidal. They're never reflective enough to be suicidal. They don't think about it. They just flip from one thing to another. When they get bored with one thing, they don't go into a depression. They just go do something else.
Sounds like, in many respects, admirable qualities, enviable qualities.
Well, until you start doing
Right.
it as crimes. So if you, one of the items on the scale is criminal versatility. If somebody murders 20 people, but that's all they do, they just murder, and they do it time and time again, they're not going to get a high score on the psychopathy scale because they're not versatile.
You're too boring to be a psychopath.
Yeah, you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Psychopaths, when they don't have someone to murder, they'll rob a bank, or they'll steal a car, or they'll use drugs, or they'll defraud somebody, or they keep their lives interesting by doing different things. But they still, throughout the whole thing, they don't lack friends. They might have one sexual partner after another, but they're never truly in love. And that's what's sad. And you made the point of that's one of the philosophical lessons. I think psychopaths put a lot of pressure on hedonistic theories of life, of the value of life, because they can be happy, but they don't have those values that we think make the happiness worthwhile.
Yeah, and of course another issue which you're interested in is moral responsibility. So,
right.
What's your view on whether or not to what degree we should hold them morally responsible for the things they do?
So that's a very interesting question. I'll mention that a lot of my work is just taking what other people have said and going, oh yeah, I agree with that. So
footnotes to Plato.
I want to make sure that I put in a plug for Kent Keel's new book called The Psychopath Whisperer, since a lot of the stuff I've been saying about psychopaths I learned from him, and he's the one that helps me get into prisons. Well, a lot of the things I learned about responsibility I learned from David Shoemaker, and he's got a new book coming out where he discusses psychopaths, but the part on psychopaths was published in the journal Ethics, and I think he's just right. You have to distinguish different notions of responsibility. It's not clear what it means. One kind of responsibility is what he calls attributability responsibility. Does the person's actions show something about their character and the kind of person they are? Well, in that sense, absolutely, psychopaths are attributable responsible. Because, the fact that they do all these crimes shows you what kind of person they are. It's not like they did it by mistake. It's not like they didn't know what they were doing. It shows you what they are. And so you can attribute to them certain bad states of character on the basis of their actions. But there's another kind of responsibility. Are they really accountable for this? Well, if their behavior is such that they had if they had a genetic condition which made them unable to learn the moral and social rules, and that's why they're doing these things in the future, in the present, then it becomes hard to see how they can be fully accountable. Maybe accountable to some degree, but not fully accountable, because of course it all comes in degrees. So you need to distinguish attributability responsibility from accountability responsibility. And my inclination would be to say, yes, they are responsible in one sense, but no, they're not in another sense. And that's what makes them so interesting philosophically, because they force us to draw those distinctions.
Now, you're a compatibilist, as all sensible people are, about free will, right? So, but
Right on.
given that, I imagine from the work that you do, you think that philosophers have something to say in the public sphere, that we can contribute to, public understandings of things like moral responsibility and whether or not psychopaths are morally responsible. But on the other hand, compatibilism is not the usual view about free will outside of philosophical circles. Do you think that being a compatibilist is a core part of your beliefs about moral responsibility, or do you think that you can divorce the issue of responsibility from your views about our place in the deterministic scheme of things?
So I think it's an open question and an empirical question whether the folk view of responsibility outside esoteric philosophical circles is an incompatibilist one. A lot of people take that for granted, but Eddie Namias in particular has done some fascinating research to suggest that that's just not true. So what's really going on is that what removes responsibility for most people and philosophers is what he calls bypassing, that the action was performed through a causal chain, because of a causal chain that bypassed your mental states. It happened not because you chose to do it, not because you wanted to do it, but because of this causal chain that was independent of your wants and choices and beliefs. And what happens is normal people say, well, if your action was caused by just the firings of neurons, it must have bypassed your desires and beliefs. That's the mistake, right? They still think you're responsible only if it bypasses your mental states, but they falsely infer from being caused by your brain that it was therefore bypassing your mental states. Whereas I would say, look, your mental states just are constituted by, or at least realized in, your brain states. So the fact that it's caused by brain states doesn't mean that you're not doing it because you want to. When somebody wants to rob a bank because they want the money, the Willie Sutton effect, that's going through their brain. That's caused by their brain. But that doesn't mean it's an excuse, because the part of the brain it went through was the part that is controlled by their desires and beliefs and wishes and choices. That's why they're responsible. So it's not whether it's caused by the brain or not, it's how it's caused by the brain that matters to responsibility.
But at the same time, that means that you can't use as an excuse your environment and your upbringing. And don't you find sympathetic the idea that, rotten social environment and constant abuse counts as ameliorating factors? Because you can say, the reason why I have those particular brain wrinkles or I have those particular brain states is something I had no control over. So in some sense, to use the language of your colleague, Van Inwagen, it's not up to me what I do. It's not up to me what I want.
So again, I think it depends on the social circumstances whether they're going to be an excuse, and it depends partly on whether it's going to bypass your mental states, to go back to Namias's view. So take, for example, someone who hits their children. Well, it could be that they were, let's imagine one person where this is true, where that's just a habit on their part. That's a reaction on their part that they learned when they were growing up from their parents who hit them. When they said something bad, they got hit. Well, they learned that as a pattern of behavior. And it might happen so quickly that when they do it as an adult to their children, they're not really thinking. They don't even want to do it. But we all have bad habits that we end up acting on and then regret later. Well, if that's what's going on, I'm inclined to say, yeah, they're not as responsible as the person who did not have that bad role model growing up and then just hits their kids because they're angry at their kids and think they ought to be able to do whatever they want, and their kids are stopping them from doing
As
what they
kids
want.
do. And
As kids
you
do.
only find out really the influence your parents had on you when you have children and you find yourself doing things.
Yes. Yes. And so think of social circumstance. I mean, just think of that as an example of social circumstances. If you're learning certain habits that are going to affect your behavior beyond what you're able to control with your conscious thoughts, so that you're going to end up doing things that you didn't really want to do, that you didn't even think about doing before you did it. And you're doing that because it's a habit that you picked up as a child or throughout your entire childhood, until you left home. Well, I think, yeah, then you're less responsible. And the same goes for crime. If people grow up in crime-ridden areas and they just learn patterns of behavior, then, yeah, they're less responsible than the people who grew up with good role models, but were just selfish and didn't, and learned on their own these criminal ways.
Now, I hate to obsess about the psychopaths, but just as a sort of a case study, I mean, it is a nice intersection of your various interests. Do you think that we should view psychopathy as on the disease model, as you say, you use that phrase in one of your works? Should we view it on the disease model, and what implications would that have for incarceration? Because on the one hand, of course, we say, if you're not guilty on the basis of insanity, well, you don't get to roam free. We send you to a mental institution and we treat you, and possibly you're stuck there for much longer than if you weren't insane. Do you think that's the model we should understand psychopaths with? Or on the other hand, what if we discover that they're untreatable or they're too clever to be affected by, psychologists? Does that have an influence on the way we should treat them?
So there is some hope that they are treatable, and we can come back to that if you want. But with regard to the insanity defense, there's a sense in which, yes, I want to say psychopaths are like schizophrenics who become violent. Paranoid schizophrenics sometimes engage in violent behavior, although a lot less often than many people think. But sometimes they do. And now you've got a question of, is it a similar process? And the answer is it's similar in some respects and not others.
It's always that answer. I hate that answer.
Always like, yeah. So I think it is a mental illness, and in that sense, it's like schizophrenia. It's a result of a genetic deficit that affects the way you learn things and that affects the way your brain functions, and that leads people to a life of crime. So in that sense, it's a brain illness and a mental illness because it affects your mental states. And that, in all of those ways, it's like schizophrenia. And it's not just a kind of aberrant or eccentric personality type. It's a mental illness because it causes the psychopath all kinds of problems. No friends, no stability, more likelihood of being in prison, more likelihood of dying than normal people. So this is an illness that carries big costs. So yes, it is like schizophrenia in being an illness. Yes, I think it does reduce responsibility. But does that mean we ought to put them in the mental institutions with the schizophrenics? Oh my God, no, absolutely not. Because they're just going to take advantage of the schizophrenics. They're going to make life hell for everybody in that institution. And so the problem is right now, it seems to me, is that the legal system has these boxes that you have to fit everybody into. Do you go into the general prison population, or do you go into a forensic psychiatric hospital with the schizophrenics? And the answer is psychopaths don't belong in either of those places. And the science and that we helped us learn so much more about psychopaths has suggested to me at least it's the legal system that has to change. We need a third type of institution geared more towards these types of people. And that's going to help the guards because the guards will better know what they're dealing with. That's going to help the other prisoners who are not psychopaths because they're not going to get infected with this total lack of concern for other people that psychopaths show. They're not going to learn tricks of manipulating others from the psychopaths, and so on and so on. So I think there's a lot to be gained by recognizing that psychopaths are different and therefore need to be treated differently. They're not really like your typical not guilty by reason of insanity person. They're also not like your typical criminal.
Now, I'm interested in issues to do with autism, and in autism there is this movement amongst people who are autistic to label something called the neurodiversity. So they want
Right.
to say, don't call it a disease. Don't say normal people versus autistic people. Say that there's neurodiversity and there's different kinds of life. Now, you want to say that, I mean, part of what you were just saying, listing the disadvantages of being a psychopath, no friends and so on. But on the other hand, I can imagine a psychopath saying, if given the chance to change, I mean, of course, now I think of Clockwork Orange. I mean, there's all these kinds of things, but something better than the Ludovico's technique, at least. But imagine there was a chance we can cure you. I can imagine a psychopath saying, hell no, I don't want to be cured. This is the way I am. I am happy. I'm capable of my own happiness. You say I don't have friends. I don't want friends. Friends are for weaklings. What do you say to that?
Well, I say you're missing out on something that's very valuable, and you might not understand how valuable it would be, but that doesn't make it any less valuable, because the reason you don't understand why it's valuable is that you're sick. I mean, that's what I say, and it's very different from the autistic case, I think. In the case of autism, I think one of the things about autism, and you might know more about this than I do, but it seems to me it comes in a lot of different degrees. An extreme autistic person could sit in the corner and rock and beat their head against the wall. That, it seems to me, is clearly an illness. That's not just neural diversity. And part of the problem is that you get degrees, and some people are labeled as autistic when there's no real observable difference between them and the people around them. They're just maybe a little odd, but that's about it. I've had a friend who's down the block who said that her son was autistic, and I'd known this kid for, a while, and he's just a normal kid.
Well, that's because you're a philosopher, so
I mean, come on.
All philosophers are supposed to be autistic.
Yeah, compared to philosophers, this kid's normal. So part of the problem with autism and neurodiversity, I think, is a great story to tell for people who are kind of called minor autistic. They don't call it Asperger's anymore, but very low on the autism scale. That's diversity that people can live with and accomplish maybe even more, and they're happy with their lives, and I don't see the problem. So I'm sympathetic with that. But then you get to the extreme end of the autism scale, and now are they saying that those people who are sitting in the corner rocking and not able to touch anybody else, not able to interact, lonely, they're, all by themselves, are they saying, well, yeah, that's just their way of life? That just strikes me as implausible.
Is that there's different kinds of difficulties. So, for example, some people who have been non-verbal until their teens, it's a bit like, I think it's related, there's a range of neurological conditions, and it's actually related with, things like not multiple sclerosis, but the muscular dystrophy, that there are some motor issues. And so, for example, people who can be entirely nonverbal and thought to be, the mental age of a toddler, it turns out they were just having communicative differences, and they end up going to college. So you can't really tell. You can't really tell about inner life.
Right. That's also true of psychopaths. I want to point that out, because when I'm talking about psychopaths, the diagnosis does not kick in until 18. These younger kids, you don't really know where they're going.
But if it turned out it was genetic, then you can say we know where you're going. Or do you think that the way that the genotype does not determine phenotype? That it's possible to have the gene, but with the right kind of conditioning, that you can escape the results?
Look, everybody agrees genotype doesn't determine phenotype. I mean, the environment has effects on how the genes express themselves.
Right. So that's
Right?
why we should delay diagnosis, is what you're saying. Because I mean, we've all known those kids who pulled the wings off flies and things like that, and were abusive to animals and stuff.
Right. And so now what you say, what do you do about that? You say, well, let's do treatment programs that are going to be non-invasive, not terribly problematic, that are actually going to help them, and figure out, what to do to help those kids avoid. Now, it might turn out that only 20% of them or 10% of them would have become real psychopaths. But the treatment might help 90% of them, even though we can't call them psychopaths yet because a very small percentage would, right? So the treatment programs can be helpful, even to the ones that we're misdiagnosing. And if that's the case, then yeah, take a chance. Now, I'm talking about treatment. So let me give you an example of what I mean by the treatment program. Michael Caldwell up in Wisconsin runs what is, to my knowledge, the only successful treatment program for psychopaths. It's aimed at adolescents from 12 to 16. Now, what I mentioned before is psychopaths are not scared of punishment, so you can't train them with punishment. They don't have empathy for their victims, so you can't train them by saying, oh, see how you hurt your little brother. And they don't have any respect for authority, so you can't turn to them and say, I'm your father, now obey me. So none of that works. So what are you going to use? Well, what Michael's, wonderful insight was, you use positive reinforcement. So these kids who have been in institutions year in, year out, and have misbehaved in those institutions and have been sent to him because none of the other institutions can handle them, they show up at his institution, and he says, well, what do you like to do? Do you like to play ping pong? Do you like to watch television? Do you like to go for walks? What do you like to do? And they've never been asked that before. But they tell him. And then he says, if you behave in certain ways and get enough points, then you'll get to do those things. So they're using positive reinforcement.
It's interesting that
to teach them how to behave.
Less concerned with pain, but they still have likes. So normally we associate,
Exactly.
You can't have the positive without the negative, that if you don't fear the bad stuff, then there won't be a corresponding good stuff. But that's apparently not the case.
Exactly, because, and why not? Well, you need neuroscience to help you understand that, because different parts of the brain are associated with the positive and the negative. And part of their brain works and part doesn't. So you got to use the parts that work to train them. But no, my point is, you take that positive reinforcement kind of schema, and you take a parent who has an 8-year-old who's starting to, hurt animals, right? And you go, look, we don't know what's going to happen to your kid. Your kid could grow up perfectly normal. We're not diagnosing anything. But what we can tell you is that this type of treatment might reduce, the problems. And what's the cost to the kid? He gets to play ping pong. I mean,
that is good. It's funny. I was thinking that that kind of result has implications for all kinds of things, like, for example, the problem of evil. Just this idea that, suffering is not really necessary for the good stuff. And I noticed that another one of your areas of your incredibly diverse areas of interest is debating things like the problem of evil, taking the atheistic side, or perhaps you would say agnostic, I don't know. Good, you're out and proud.
I would say atheistic.
For example, you wrote that book with William Lane Craig, and you debated him publicly. Why do you do that?
Well, I didn't do it until my parents were both dead, because they would have been very upset me coming out of the closet. But I started to notice patterns in our culture. Matthew Shepard being killed for being gay, even though by all accounts he was a very sweet, non-intrusive young boy. And the people who did that claiming biblical authority for it, and some biblical groups saying, yeah, it was a good thing. And I just went, what is going on? And then people speaking out against, for example, stem cell research, which could solve problems for people with juvenile diabetes, a horrible illness. And stem cell research could have helped that a long time before it did if religious groups had not gotten in the way. When they held a panel to investigate whether the government, or to discuss whether the government should fund stem cell research, the report that I heard from a member of the government committee was that nobody showed up to the committee to speak against stem cell research except people who were there specifically to represent religious groups. So what you get is religion stopping medical advances, hurting young kids like Matthew Shepard. Obviously, those are the worst sides of religion, and there are really good sides of religion as well. But when you see it causing all of that trouble, you wonder, well, is there some way to live without religion and yet still be compassionate and still be charitable and still have a community and still gain many of the things that are positive that people get out of religion? So that's really what motivated me, was to try to look for an alternative that would be less destructive.
Yeah,
and still
I noticed
get the goods
you
of
have
religion.
something in that Louise Anthony collection, philosophy, and actually another person I've just interviewed, Elizabeth Anderson, had a piece in there too, and she said
did. A very good one.
Christopher Hitchens took it without asking. And that became her most read piece because it was in Hitchens' collection, as which has probably sold a few more than Louise Anthony's. But and she said she reported that she got a lot of positive emails from people who had been raised in a very Christian household and were wrestling with these issues. Did you find that, or do you find that? Because there's one might be tempted to say that what you're doing in arguing the atheistic side is not going to work on religious people, because what they just did a study where the feature that makes a politician trusted the least of all features is being an atheist. Like they can be convicted of all kinds of crimes, and they're that's not as bad as being an atheist. So you come out in public and you debate for the atheistic side, isn't that going to just turn off people to your point of view?
Well, it's certainly going to turn off some people, but they probably didn't share my point of view anyway. And so I'm not sure any harm was done. I will say people are very pessimistic about the force of discussion and argument, but just in my debates with William Lane Craig, for example, I had a graduate student who was studying with Craig in seminary who said when he read the book, he left seminary.
His parents are mad at you.
So I know. And so I think, people give up too easily. But the real trick, it seems to me, is not, those are rare. That kind of case is rare. And you don't want to focus your arguments on that. So when I go into one of these debates, what happens is, there's 60% of the people who are just committed Christians. They're totally on the side of the evangelical. They're going to cheer and applaud whenever he or she gets in a good line. And when I say something, they're going to remain silent or, even shake their heads and so on. Or pray for me, I hope. Then there are 20% who are on my side, or maybe 10%. Maybe I exaggerate the number. And when I say things, it's going to be the same way. They're going to cheer and applaud. And when Craig says something, if he's the other debater, they're going to, boo or shake their heads, But then sometimes there's like 10 or 20% in the middle who are actually listening. Now, I don't know about you, but when I give a philosophy talk, I'm lucky if there are like 30, 40 people there. Whereas when I give one of these things, I remember one of my debates with Craig, there were literally 15,000 people listening. in the church. It was this mega church. There are 15,000 people listening.
Right.
So 10% of that, please point out, is 1,500.
Yeah, and
That's a lot of
and they're
people.
listening to
So if
real
only-
intellectual debate in the public sphere, which is practically dead.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have some people who are truly open-minded and that will actually listen to your arguments, and so it really matters whether you formulate your argument well. It'll make a difference to them and their lives, and it'll make a difference to the country. Because after all, Bush versus Gore, what? Less than 1% of the difference. If you change some people, even a small number,
Well, one of
these
9
days,
people would
it
have
can
been
make a big difference.
9 particular people would have been useful.
That is absolutely
Okay,
correct.
there's so many things that you've written on, and I want to touch on as many as possible. One of the other things is neural detection of consciousness in brain-damaged patients. What's your interest there?
So I got interested in that only recently when I read some of the new techniques they're developing, and I think they raise very interesting questions. And when I run into some new questions I don't know anything about, but I want to learn more about, my standard tendency is I have a conference. And I invite the people that do know something about it. And so that's what we did at Duke. There was a conference on these issues, and some of the leaders from around the world came and shared their research and their insights, and we discussed for several days. And now we have a collection coming out on that
Think
topic.
about it. I'm going to have a conference.
Yeah, it's great. And so what happens is you can take somebody who has suffered traumatic brain injury and is showing no outward signs of consciousness whatsoever. In one case, diagnosed 4 separate occasions by some of the top experts in the field. They all agree no signs of consciousness whatsoever. And then what you do is you train them. They're not moving, but you put them in a scanner and you say, can you think about playing tennis? And then after 30 seconds, you say, now stop thinking about playing tennis. And now think about walking through your house. And then after 30 seconds, now stop thinking about walking through your house. And you can tell the difference in the brain activation between when they're thinking about playing tennis and when they're thinking about walking through their house. Now, I hasten to add, this only happens in 40% of the traumatic brain injury cases and less than 10% of the overall people who have diagnosed in persistent vegetative state. So this doesn't mean that people who have brain disease or anoxia, it's only the traumatic brain injury cases, and it's about 40% of them can show this ability to control their brain waves, even though they can't move their body at all.
Fairly recent case, well, it's not so recent anymore, is Terry Schiavo. And when they did the autopsy of her, the brain had basically liquefied, right? So that wouldn't have been...
Exactly. None of this research will show any chance of Terry Schiavo having had the slightest bit of consciousness. It's not gonna generalize to that. But still, there are thousands of people that it would affect. Not her, but thousands of others. And they can even answer questions. You can ask them, is your father's name Thomas? If it is, think about playing tennis. Mm-hmm. If it's not, think about walking through your house. People have done this and gotten factual questions like that correct. And then you can ask them, are you in pain? And you can ask them, are you hungry? You can ask them, do you want to die? And that raises a lot of very interesting issues, it seems to me, because we want to make sure that they have autonomy in their medical decisions over their own lives, and yet, do they really understand what's going on? How do we tell whether the consent or refusal to treatment is a competent consent
and of course, it also raises all kinds of issues to do with resources. I mean, now we have a bunch of people who would have been organ donors, who would have been heart donors, presumably, if they're breathing, and of course you have to take a heart from a breathing individual, otherwise you can't use it. And now these people are no longer heart donors.
That's right. But I don't want
Right.
to turn them into heart donors just because we need
Well,
their heart.
it's like
Thinking. There might be better ways to get other organs. I mean, all you gotta do is change the default and say, if you're not if you don't specifically say I'm not an organ donor, then you
that's
are.
True.
Bam, solve that resource problem.
Okay, let me see. Oh, yes. Another, of course, enormously important area that we've sort of touched on. You've got that 3-volume set, Moral Psychology, the Evolution of Morality, the Cognitive Science of Morality, and the Neuroscience of Morality.
And now it's up to 4. Don't miss the 4th volume, which is Responsibility and Free Will.
You've got that other volume about conscious will and responsibility, talking about the limits.
Oh, yeah. You didn't buy my book. You just checked it out of the library.
So say a little bit about the evolution of moral psychology, because I think evolutionary psychology, when you put evolution and psychology together and you get evolutionary psychology, that's pretty controversial sphere. What are you saying about the evolution of moral psychology?
So I just want to get clear. Are you asking about the evolution of moral psychology, how the field has changed? Evolution of morality. I mean, there are certain instincts in other species that suggest that some parts of what have come to be morality are present in bonobos.
Bonobos are nice, but not the chimps.
Even chimps. It's nice, but they still have. Not all of morality is nice. Some of morality is revenge. Some of morality is, killing people who, in order to prevent them from killing other people, protecting others. And so reciprocity is not always nice. Punishment is not always nice.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Are you still there?
Yeah, now I got
the video seems to have gone off.
It'll probably come back. Yeah, there we go. I can see you. Yeah, so keep talking.
Okay, good. So they have, some elements that seem to be related to things that we view as morality. I don't know that they judge each other by intentions in the way that we do. I don't know that they follow rules. They certainly don't care about keeping their promises the way humans do. And so there are other parts of morality that are not shared with other species. And so they might have evolved, but they evolved much later than the common ancestor of bonobos and humans. So what does that tell you? Well, one lesson that I would draw from that is that morality is not really a unified thing. There are parts of morality that are shared with other species. There are other parts that are not shared with other species. And that means that you shouldn't be thinking of morality as a single thing that can be studied as a whole. Instead, you need to be more specific and look at the parts of morality.
It's kind of like language
if you really
games
want to make
within
progress.
Morality. I mean, to use a Wittgensteinian analogy, like he said about language, you shouldn't think of language as one big thing. You should think of these small pockets that are maybe isolated from each other.
In that way, it's similar, except it's biology instead of convention. So I think I think of it like memory. Memory includes remembering how to ride a bicycle, remembering what a word means, remembering that the 5th digit of pi is 3.14159. And so you can remember things that are timeless. I remember that tomorrow I've got a luncheon date. But I don't remember when I made that luncheon date. So you can remember all kinds of things, not just the past, and you can remember it semantically or episodically. And when did the study of the psychology of memory and the neuroscience of memory really take off? It was when people quit trying to formulate theories about memory as a whole and instead started formulating theories about particular parts of memory. And I think that's the revolution we need in moral psychology and also moral philosophy.
An awful lot of what you're doing now is informed directly by science, that you get these things from science that you find fascinating, and then you tease out the philosophical implications.
I know, and other philosophers think that's weird. Like you actually want to check out the facts before you start.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that's what we got into philosophy to avoid. So was that always an interest of yours? I mean, I see that your thesis was on moral dilemmas, but it seems like you've sort of progressed to now you're doing this enormous profusion of things that is very much drawing from science. Is that something you've sort of segued into somehow, or was that always an interest for you?
So psychology and neuroscience have always been a side interest. I seriously considered being a psychology major as an undergrad in college, but back then you really had two options at the college that I went to. You could either, in psychology, you could either be a follower of Skinner and a behaviorist, and then you spent your days, watching rats run through mazes, or you could be a Freudian, and then you seem to have very little evidence for the things that you were claiming. And so I didn't like either of those. And if you were a neuroscientist, what you were doing was, you were cutting open animals' brains and sticking electrodes in them, and I didn't want to do that either. So I think I turned to philosophy because it was addressing the issues I wanted to address. But I always had an inclination for the scientific method as a way of finding out what was going on. And it was only much later when people developed the methods of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, that we then became able to approach the larger philosophical issues using the tools of science. So I think that interest was always there. I married a psychologist after all, and it was only in the 2000s that we became able to really use the new knowledge to address
do you think this is where
issues.
Philosophy is going? I mean, there does seem to be a movement to have more empirical input, which is obviously a good thing. What do you think of experimental philosophy, this new trend?
So let me answer those questions separately,
Yes.
because the first question was, is this where philosophy is moving? And I don't think philosophy moves in any direction, because philosophy is a diverse group of people with very different interests using very different methods, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I think that the percentage of people in philosophy who are also doing scientific experiments, and not certainly the percentage that are reading scientific journals, is going to increase. And the percentage of philosophers who are doing scientific experiments is going to increase over the next couple of decades. I think that's a trend which anyone who is looking at the field would predict. But that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people doing analytic philosophy as well. I still write articles about analytic paradoxes. It seems to me that you can use these two different methods, and what's interesting is to see how they relate to each other. When they conflict with each other, you have to decide what to do. When they agree with each other, you feel a lot more confident. And so adding the science should be seen as adding it on top, not replacing the more traditional philosophy. The second question you asked was about experimental philosophy. Well, that's often associated with should I say, surveys of opinions in the folk. I think those can be very interesting, but they're quite limited, often because you don't know exactly what's going on in the folks' brain. Is it an intuition, or are they reflecting and applying a principle? It's very hard to tell. What happens? What about order effects? What about wording effects? Those experiments are interesting and suggestive, but they have their limits, like any experiment does. Most of the work that I do, I do some of those, but most of the work I do is instead looking at brain scans, looking at implicit moral attitudes, looking at clinical cases, That's also a type of empirical philosophy, but it's not experimental philosophy of the survey sort that's probably better
Yeah.
known to philosophers.
So, do you think that your view of morality has been affected by your, getting engaged with the sciences, or do you think that your view of morality has been pretty firmly formed by your years in philosophy up to that point? Do you think that it should be that's something that can be I don't know, influenced by learning more about neuroscience, or do you think that there are some areas of philosophy that are sort of off limits from what you learn in brain sciences?
Well, I think there's some areas of philosophy and of common sense that are off limits. I think it's going to be very difficult to imagine any experiment or any philosophical argument that's going to convince me that violent rape is not wrong. That's just off limits. It's hard for me to imagine how that would happen. I don't think it could happen. But some very deep assumptions can still be questioned. So, for example, I mentioned this a minute ago in the analogy to memory. I used to think morality is a certain kind of thing. There's a certain types of judgments that are moral judgments. And I was interested in what distinguished those moral judgments from other judgments that are not moral judgments. And a lot of philosophical theories depend on that. Kant says that it's just of the nature of morality that moral oughts are categorical. And others have held similar views that make claims about what's true of all and only moral judgments. And I think when you look more at the empirical data and the neuroscience as well as the behavioral psychology, that view is just not sustainable anymore. There's just not a single thing that is morality, which is not to say that there's nothing wrong with rape, and it's not to say it's not morally wrong. It's just to say that's a very different case from lying or from cannibalism or from burning a flag or from many other types of immorality. There's a whole bunch of different types of things that get thrown under the name immoral, and it's not at all clear that they have anything in common that makes them immoral rather than simply imprudent or unconventional.
So for example, Haidt
or whatever.
wants to say that in some sense conservatives have a broader palette of morality because they find certain things immoral that liberals or whatever want to reduce everything to harm. So if it doesn't harm, then it's not immoral, whereas conservatives say, no, it doesn't have to harm to be immoral. And seems to be suggesting that, the left or the liberals or whatever are stunted in some way because they don't have this broad palette of morality.
Yeah, although I don't know that Haidt really needs to claim that they're stunted. They're just different, right? It might be that the conservatives are reacting to something that's an illusion because we feel disgust at things that we know are illusions. Most people will not drink a glass of water that has a piece of plastic in it with an encased cockroach, right? Even though they know it's absolutely clean and pure, they still won't drink it because they feel this disgust reaction. Now, that's just an illusion. And his studies suggest that conservatives have disgust reactions when liberals don't. But you don't know whether that's an illusion or whether that's something that, the poor liberals just don't see it. Well, you could go either way. And
there isn't really a place to stand on to make the judgment because you haven't got a moral theory that everyone can accept whereby we can judge that doesn't count as morality.
And the other thing is he talks about impurity, and he gives examples of sex and cannibalism being examples of impurity. And then he says liberals don't react to impurity. Well, wait a minute. Let's use different kinds of impurity. Let's talk about genetically modified organisms. Let's talk about pollution in the environment. well, maybe it's just that liberals react to different types of impurity than conservatives do, not that they don't have that taste bud, as he says. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area before we can draw the kinds of conclusions that he draws. But I will say, a lot of people badmouth John Haidt. That work raises fascinating questions, and I think some of it is actually very well done, and I think that is a lot to be said in favor of it, even if after further research, a lot of it comes to be questioned.
I don't think he's really trying to win over the philosophers. He seems not to have much respect. Like, he disposes of Kant and Bentham on a couple of pages, like, oh, they were both autistic, so we don't have to listen to them. So it's almost like he's just trying to provoke us. Okay, now, there was one more thing I wanted. Oh, yes. One of the videos of yours online is how to do an online course. And this was for Coursera. This was one of these massively, what is it? MOOCs, massively something online course. That's right. Now,
an online course.
How have you found that? Have you enjoyed that? Do you think that that's an important thing? Because a lot of people, of course, in academia are worried about these and have conflicting emotions about such things.
So I have conflicting emotions too, but I'm extremely optimistic because whenever something new comes along, there are dangers and it can be abused, and you have to be careful that it doesn't. I'm extremely excited about that. I mean, that could be the most meaningful thing in my philosophical life right now, because we've had over 500,000 students register for the course, and they're from all over the world, and they write and say that they learned a lot and appreciated having that available. In other parts of the world outside the United States, people often do not have access to adequate education, and that holds them back and very much dampens their life prospects. And if I can do anything to help, I'm more than happy to put the time in. And it does take a tremendous amount of time, and I don't make any money off it. So I really, want to help people. Now, the problem is when you are helping those people overseas, and 2/3 of my students are overseas. I should add, by the way, I say my students, but Ram Netta and I teach this course together. This is Duke working together with Chapel Hill, so we ought to advertise that. 2/3 of the students are overseas, and I am happy to help them get education that they don't have access to otherwise. The problem occurs when people like the president of San Jose State says, well, we're going to stop funding the philosophy department because our students can just take these MOOCs. Well, that's crazy. That should not happen, right? Nobody thinks this MOOC is a substitute for a real course. I certainly don't. What it is it's half as good as a real course, but more than some people have access to. I think a lot of the controversy about MOOCs is people think that it's going to undermine some institutions that are serving populations that we really need to serve. And the people who do MOOCs like me need to get involved in stopping that from happening. Telling the president of San Jose State that's not the way to use MOOCs. That's just wrong. The other opposition, I think, comes from people who say that students will just be absorbing material and that's not as good as talking in the classroom. Well, I think that's not a real problem. And the reason I don't think that's a real problem is that I show my students the lectures on the MOOCs, and then I have more time to talk to them in classroom. So it's not that the MOOC replaces the classroom time.
Well, that's something
it frees up the classroom time.
That's something they're actually trying in the high schools. It's called flipping, or I believe, where they have the kids watch the videos for their homework and then do their homework in class, where they can ask the teacher they can talk to their teacher about their homework so that when they're doing their homework, they can interact. And that's apparently had a lot of success.
Right. And I put the classroom at Duke, and what we do in the classroom is we do writing assignments for every class, and then the students share their writing assignments and comment on each other, and I talk to them about it. And that's something I never could do if the classroom time was taken up with lectures. And then we have plenary sessions where we have a college bowl night and a murder mystery and a scavenger hunt, and class becomes this fun activity that you do together, and the boring lecture stuff, is
right. I
is
just
done on
worry
the web
because
before classroom starts.
in Michigan, there's a lot of talk from the legislature of online high schools. And I think online high schools would be the worst thing imaginable. I mean, because I don't know, I've taught, actually I'm about to teach online classes, but I've taught classes with an online element, and I know that there's a huge dropout rate in online classes, and there's a certain kind of person who will thrive in there, who is very self-motivated and very, already engaged in the material, just wants to be told what to read, and they're going to thrive. But the majority of people, they need the structure. They need to come in. They need someone to know their name. They need to talk about this stuff. They need to see other people caring about this stuff and asking questions about it. Otherwise, they're just going to flounder.
Sure, and so it's definitely not a replacement. I'm totally agree with you about that. But it's also important to know while you're doing your online class, for example, I can keep better track of my students when I teach it online than when I'm in class. And here's why. If I'm lecturing to 150 people, there's some people out there, I don't know which ones are even paying attention. They might not have their computer out doing email, but who knows whether they're paying attention or whether they, are reading something on the side or whether they're just dozing off. Who knows what's going on? Well, if there are 150 people and I don't know, I can't call them out. But when my students take their lectures online, they're like little 5 to 10 minute lectures, sometimes 15 or 20, but I think the average is probably about 10 per lecture. And then there's some exercises. And then they do another lecture and some more exercises and another lecture and more exercises, 10 minutes each. Well, I know for every student how many lectures they watched, how long they spent watching, how many exercises they did, how many of them they got right. And if somebody starts to flounder, I can stop them right then. I don't have to wait for the midterm and find out that this student has not been getting it and it's too late for them to catch up. I can catch them right then and there with the electronic monitoring. It sounds like Big Brother, but yeah, it is Big Brother. It's watching these students because my students never fail because they lack intelligence. My students fail because they get too far behind and never catch up. And that's what I want to stop. And it's much easier to stop that when it's online and when you're having these small discussion groups, but the lectures are done online, than when you're lecturing to 150 students and you don't even know.
And of course, when the iPhone gets the fMRI app, you'll be able to scan their brains and see if they're taking in the information that way.
Yeah. So maybe, but the bottom line is whenever you got a new technology like this, there are going to be good ways to use it, and there are going to be bad ways to use it. And so what we need to do is to get together as a community, you and I, and if the people in Michigan are saying these things should replace high school courses, look, get teachers of high school courses to explain why that's not going to work, and get the people who are making MOOCs to explain that's not going to work. That's not what this is for, and it doesn't serve that purpose, but it serves other purposes. We get grad students here who maybe didn't have logic in college. How are they going to catch up? Well, they take a logic course. Well, maybe we don't offer one till next fall. They got to wait. No, if there's a MOOC, bam, start it now. Start in the summer before your graduate school experience. Now those courses that you didn't have, you can make up that background. You can show up better prepared. Same thing with undergrads. You don't want to take the logic course because you really want to take this other course, and they're taught at the same time, and you can't take them both. Whoa, what do you mean you can't take them both? You can take them both. You only get credit for one, but you can take the logic on the side and learn the things you need. So there are a lot of uses of MOOCs that will benefit large numbers of people both inside the United States and outside the United States. But they have to be used properly. And that's going to be, they won't be used properly. Whenever there's a transition, there will be abuses. And we just have to watch and
well,
make sure
I've
those
taken
abuses
up
are corrected.
so much of your time. I didn't get to ask about global warming, but you're talking about that on YouTube. People can find that out for themselves. But thanks very much for doing this. This is great.
Thanks for having me. It was fun talking to you.